this is right now, streaming to you on the CBS 8 app. Today is Thursday, August 6th. I am Chris Gros, joined here, as always, by Jack Hull. And Jack, a lot to get to today, as always. We have a jam-packed show. We're going to start here in Washington, D.C., but we will be going abroad to the issues in Iran. We'll be picking up stories right here in San Diego. How it is that a nationwide outbreak is even tied to San Diego. So a lot on the menu, so to speak, if you will.
Very much so. A lot of stuff off the menu, too, as you mentioned there. We'll break all that down. Plus, football is back today. We're going to talk about that a little bit. Football is back. So exciting time here. But, of course, as you mentioned, the top story today is in Washington. It was this morning a continuation of something we covered last week, and that has been Dr. Anthony Fauci and this ongoing debate with him and Senator Rand Paul. Senator Rand Paul, of course, chairs a key Senate committee here, and they took some decisive action regarding his statements or lack thereof from last week.
Yeah, they did. And we should note that Dr. Fauci was not present for today's committee hearing. However, there was someone who was at the previous hearing who was tied to that hearing that was today. We'll get to that in a little bit. But this morning, the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee voted to hold Dr. Anthony Fauci in contempt of Congress. Fauci guided the U.S. COVID pandemic response across two administrations, both Trump and Biden. Fauci invoked his constitutional right last week against self-incrimination more than 100 times during the testimony. Speaking with a reporter Monday, committee chair Rand Paul said the committee would immediately send the results of today's vote to the Department of Justice. He insisted the panel does not need a full Senate vote to refer Fauci for contempt charges. Before leaving office, President Joe Biden issued preemptive pardons for Fauci and others targeted, or that could be potentially targeted, by incoming President Donald Trump. Again, we should note that this time around, for all intents and purposes, he's being targeted by Senator Rand Paul, and not really at the behest of President Trump. Now, I have not, I cannot say that I've seen or read any statements on behalf of President Trump in regards to this news as of yet. But I do think that that's a pretty noteworthy thing that we always make, and note of President Trump's assumed, enemies list, if you will. And Dr. Fauci doesn't. I don't know if Dr. Fauci necessarily fits into that sort of enemies category for President Trump. Because it's someone who they seemingly had a working. Dr. Fauci had private thoughts that we now know of from that journal, but it was a working relationship.
There's no reported tie, I would say is the right way to frame it, between this effort that we're seeing here that's being spearheaded by the Senator of Kentucky, Rand Paul, and President Trump. Outside of shortly after that hearing last week, we did see the White House post on their COVID website what they believe is, and we'll talk a little bit in a little bit of detail in just a second, is the lab leak theory. So I think it's safe to say here that to tie President Trump into this is just to say that the president and Senator Rand Paul are ideologically in lockstep as far as it comes to what were the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic. That doesn't necessarily mean that, like you mentioned, this was an effort that was spearheaded by President Trump necessarily. This is something that has been an ongoing debate, feud, whatever you want to call it, between Dr. Anthony Fauci and Senator Rand Paul for a number of years now. So let's get to what we're hearing from Rand Paul. Senator Rand Paul for years has long argued that Fauci should shoulder the blame for the COVID pandemic and the response, both the cause and the effect here. Paul has tried to prosecute Fauci for his actions multiple times to no avail. And prior to that appearance last week, it was actually Rand Paul and the committee that released more than 1,000 pages from his personal diary from those years. They were found on government servers. It's supposed that a lot of this was in preparation for a memoir. We were kind of trying to describe it. And we used the term diary, which isn't necessarily, we both agreed wasn't the most apt term for it. We think like a captain's log. It is a good way to think of it. Of course, he was the captain, so to speak, of the COVID response during the Trump and Biden administrations. But those writings, they included a multitude of things. Fauci's concerns about the pandemic, the responses and the potential frustrations that he saw. One of the things that was the crux of this hearing, of course, was COVID origins, NIH-funded research in Wuhan, and that is to say, was this a natural jump from an animal to man, or was this a result of what is referred to
lab leak,
as gain of function, a gain of function research. Now, really quickly, just to make it clear, the scientific consensus at this time leans heavily in the favor of that natural animal to human jump. However, Dr. Fauci himself has said that there is spirited debate, and there is, while it's not the general consensus, there is certain validities to those theories about it, but we don't have an ironclad conclusion as of right now. We know that various government agencies are divided on what they believe is the one. I believe the CIA is one of those agencies that leans towards the lab leak theory. So there's, we're just going off of the scientific consensus here. This is something that is hotly debated.
Yeah.
We saw it hotly debated in this hearing, even though we saw Dr. Anthony Fauci plead the fifth. I think the count that Senator Paul said today was 111 times. I think that was his final tally. So we've been saying over 100, but that's what he said during his statements today.
And a lot of that too, though, was for instance, Senator Josh Hawley was asking, a number of questions to try to prove that point. Seemingly,
color of his tie, the color of the carpet, the day of the week.
Is it?
He said today that that was a quote unquote litmus test about good faith. Fifth Amendment pleas there. But part of Paul's year-long accusations is that Fauci lied about the pandemic specifically. Those are claims that Fauci has called preposterous. He said that in the advent of the pandemic. That was something that was in his diary. It's something that he's been steadfast in his belief on that. And that steadfast belief is something that continued to last week. Now, we mentioned that Dr. Fauci pled the fifth over 100 times, but prior to the beginning of that, he prefaced it during his opening remarks with a sort of summation of what he feels about not just Senator Rand Paul, but the inquiry in question. So we're going to play this again for you before we jump into today's vote, some of the questions that we might be asking ourselves thereafter. But first, let's take a listen to Dr. Fauci.
Given Senator Paul's obvious obsession with calling for my prosecution, his repeated slanderous comments about me, and recently his publicly releasing my unredacted personal diary aimed at embarrassing and intimidating me, the only conclusion I can reach is that the sole reason he is calling me before this committee is to get me to say something, anything, that could vindicate his repeated public pledges that I end up, in his words, quote, behind bars, unquote. Any reasonable person who has followed his unhinged obsession with me would readily come to the same conclusion. Therefore, although it pains me to do so, because of the respect I have for the legislative branch of government and my decades-long record of cooperating with Congress, under the advice of my attorneys, I will invoke my right under the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution to refrain from answering your questions. Thank you.
So plead the fifth, he did.
Yeah,
multiple times over.
111 times.
And of course, the Fifth Amendment is your constitutional right to avoid self-incrimination. If there is a worry that you are going to be put under the spotlight, under oath, and say something that could incriminate you, this is something that you can do. However, there is a certain context surrounding his constitutional right for a Fifth Amendment that is murkying the debate a little bit. And I'll let you describe it. Specifically, the fact that he had received a pardon prior to this. So explain that for us, Chris.
So basically the idea is that he was pardoned by, as we said before, is that President Biden on his sort of last days in office set out a series of pardons, and a lot of them were meant to be preemptive, because this idea was that the incoming Trump administration was going to target officials and or lawmakers and or even family members. As we know, very famously, Hunter Biden received some protections as well, too, the son of President Joe Biden, and whether or not Trump would indeed be going after these individuals in this preemptive sort of sweeping pardons that were given. The idea, at least from Senator Rand Paul, and we'll hear from him on this as well, too, is that those pardons then sort of render your ability to use the Fifth Amendment useless. I don't know if that's something that's been argued prior in a court of law outside of a Senate committee hearing. Because if you think about it, presidential pardons, while they happen very often, it's very rare that someone who receives a presidential pardon is then called to testify before a Senate committee hearing. So I feel like this might be the first test of this theory.
I believe it's been mentioned that this is an unprecedented legal test.
Unprecedented legal test where, you know, the right to potentially not criminate yourself, you know, if you're testifying before Congress, that within itself, you're not testifying to, of course, law enforcement. Now, of course, what you say in a Senate hearing can be used to build a case against you by the Department of Justice. Those findings can be forwarded to the Department of Justice, similar to how this contempt charge is. So it is definitely a theory, and it is one that is going to be tested here as we move forward. Do we want to listen to Senator Rand Paul sort of explain this? Again, this was his main point for having this vote today. It was a 8-7 vote across party lines. Democrats tried to hold this up. They mentioned, obviously, how they felt like this was something that was not only unprecedented but illegal, because they felt that this needed to go to a full Senate vote. Senator Paul seemingly just saying, nope, this committee, we're going to forward it to the Department of Justice.
Here's his argument relating to Dr. Fauci's Fifth Amendment rights.
8 days ago, Dr. Anthony Fauci sat before this committee in the witness chair under subpoena for conduct covered by the President Biden's full and unconditional pardon, reaching back to 2014. Dr. Fauci faced no risk of federal prosecution. All he had to do was tell the truth. More than 100 times, though, he refused. The chair ruled that Dr. Fauci's assertion of the Fifth Amendment privilege was unsupported in light of the pardon and the testimony he offered in his opening statement. The chair directed Anthony Fauci to answer. He refused again. That is what we are voting on today. Not his opinions, not his policies, not anything he said from a podium 6 years ago. We are voting on whether a witness who has received the benefit of a sweeping federal pardon can be ordered by this committee to answer questions and then defy that order without consequence.
And yeah, that sweeping pardon, preemptive, covers a multitude of different things, but what that scope is something that's certainly going to be a subject of debate here. So you mentioned it. During this vote, a lengthy-ish meeting for what was, you know, most of the time is assumed to be a rather routine vote. You put the motion, you vote on it, motion passes or motion fails, but we did see Democrats take multiple attempts here to either delay or to just state their argument. So again, this was an issue that Republicans, Democrats were jousting over this morning. Democrats maintain that the law is on Dr. Fauci's side, that no pardon, no previous pardon, preemptive pardon is grounds to discredit the Fifth Amendment rights. That's what we're hearing from Democrats.
It's supposed to be a constitutional right, and again, enshrined in the Constitution. So I have never heard of a constitutional right being sort of rendered useless simply because of X happens.
It's certainly something that's going to give the legal community a lot of time here to discuss and debate. Would not be shocked to see this operate through the court system. But they also warned, the Democrats do, on this committee, that this could set a dangerous precedent for other people who are testifying in front of, whether it's a Senate committee, whether it's the full Senate, going forward, yada, yada, yada. Here's Democratic Senator Gary Peters from Michigan, ranking member of the committee. Here's his statements on today's vote.
If this committee now seeks to punish a witness for asserting their constitutional protected Fifth Amendment rights, future witnesses will argue that appearing before Congress exposes them to punishment regardless of whether they comply with the subpoena and invoke a constitutional protection. They will point directly to this vote as a justification for refusing to appear at all.
So there you have it. There were multiple attempts to delay for motions. There was a motion to delay it until they could hear from Dr. Fauci's lawyer. You may remember he was escorted out of the building for attempting to speak on his client's behalf at that point.
Last week.
This was last week. Multiple different reasons for those motions to delay the vote. However, all of that amounted to nothing. Each one was put to a motion. They were voted down 7-8 on a party line vote. That 7-8/8-7. You're going to see that a lot if you're watching this in replay, because ultimately the Senate did vote in favor of contempt again on an 8-7 party line vote. That meaning that committee has 8 Republicans, 7 Democrats. So I mean, there was no real assumption here that this wasn't going to go. This was pretty set in stone just based off the political math going into this hearing. But of course, you're seeing attempts there to do it. All different senators making their case as to why this should not. A lot of Democrats pointed to President Trump when he was under oath to the New York Attorney General Letitia James. He pled the fifth numerous times, calling out hypocrisy. We see this happen all the time in these committees. Democrats, however, are calling this vote illegitimate due to the fact, as you mentioned here, that this was done by a Senate committee and not the full Senate in itself. Their argument here is that it is the full Senate that is required to vote on contempt charges. They're saying that Rand Paul, essentially side-skirted the rules there.
Yeah, and it will be interesting to see because will it be the what's the term for it? But there is the Senate rules. Like official, basically, they have someone, the parliamentarian. Does the parliamentarian sort of make a ruling on this? Do they sort of discuss this? And does that even matter? Because essentially this has already been forwarded to the Department of Justice. It will be interesting.
One of the motions that I mentioned was to put it to a full Senate vote. I forgot, I didn't have that in my notes, but that was one of those motions that used to delay, got voted down on a party line vote.
So we'll see. We do have reaction from the attorney for Dr. Anthony Fauci. This is a portion of a statement here from David Schertler. It says, quote, "Today's partisan committee vote is a crude political stunt intended to punish Dr. Fauci for exercising his constitutional rights. The Senate should reject Senator Paul's meritless and politically motivated contempt resolution."
Yeah, he continues to say, for years, Senator Paul has proclaimed to anyone who would listen that Dr. Fauci should be prosecuted and put in prison. Dr. Fauci has committed no crime, and Senator Paul knows it. So the vote has been cast. As far as we know, this is contempt charges that have been voted on. So the next step is actually pretty interesting here because the person who may be responsible for handling this and making this decision of whether to pursue charges or not is someone who is under some internal fire from President Trump himself.
Yeah, it's Jeanine Pirro. I'm actually shocked that this is not going to be. This is going to end up in the U.S. Attorney's Office of Jeanine Pirro, and that's sort of that because she sort of handles like D.C. area crime because D.C. is not its own, state, which that's its own debate there. But in its municipality, Jeanine Pirro is sort of in charge of that. I thought that this would maybe go to a higher attorney general, like for instance Todd Blanche, who's gunning for that job. But look, this puts her in a position where many have argued that a lot of Trump's appointees will oftentimes take on either meritless or sort of cases lacking evidence in order to try to curry favor. You mentioned she's in hot water. She's in hot water over her handling of the reflection pool, the arrest of the former Olympian for charges of vandalizing it. And obviously they dropped those charges. President Trump very publicly denounced that, said that she folded like an umbrella.
Yeah, he also said she
choked, multiple like sort of derogatory sports statements that you would often hear, or maybe from his time on The Apprentice, for instance. A lot of people hearkened back to that. But regardless, has drawn the ire from President Trump for dropping those. Pirro could be the one to decide whether to prosecute Dr. Fauci, and this will be a true litmus test for maybe the remainder of her time in this role. I mean, a lot of people saw her walking out of, I believe it was the U.S. Attorney's Office with the rolling backpack. And a lot of people were like, oh my God, she's already been fired. But it turns out that was the pages of evidence that she presented to Trump's team about, or maybe the lack of evidence. But basically the case saying that this is why we need to drop these charges.
She went so far as to blame the Interior Secretary, Doug Burgum, for giving the president false information. And it was reported that in that case specifically, and I think this is important to mention here because this in a way could tie into what we see, is because she said that it was based off of the internal assumptions. So she was using official statements as that cause. Now, that is not the evidence. Those are not the facts. So she ended up making that executive decision to drop those charges. Again, that was much to the ire of President Trump. She instead blamed Doug Burgum for not only giving the president false information, but rushing this project through a contractor. That contractor had previous work with multiple Trump-owned properties. President Trump has said that he did not know who that was. So there's been some contradictory statements as to the relationship between President Trump and that contractor. We're not trying to get too far on the side.
The reflection pool thing, but yeah, but that is sort of her first handling, and we know President Trump looks for loyalty despite maybe where the evidence goes. So we'll have to see. This could be one of those things where she does take the case, but will the case actually be prosecuted?
What is going to be the constitutional merits of a decision like this? Not only when it comes to the Fifth Amendment itself, but as we talked about, there is that debate over being a Senate committee versus the full Senate. So she's got a bunch of different legal questions to handle as she juggles this decision of whether to pursue charges against Dr. Fauci or not. And is this going to be something where she feels perhaps that pressure from the president? We know that the origins of COVID hasn't necessarily been something we've heard the president talk about too much here. It's been a lot of other different stuff. We've talked about different beautification projects. We've talked about the election results of 2020. There have been a lot of things that we have seen President Trump talk about on Truth Social and all that. This one, I think it's fair to say, has fallen relatively low on the president's priority list. So it's going to be really interesting to see what the decision here from the Department of Justice is.
Yeah, it definitely has been low on the priority list for the Trump administration to sort of relitigate. And I think that there's also a bit of a juxtaposition of, or a little bit of like math going on in President Trump's head, where the COVID vaccine, which is a part of this, like the rollout of the vaccine, Senator Rand Paul has been a critic of that. That was an accomplishment under the first Trump administration, and they have had a complicated sort of history or way of going about what was considered at the time to be such an accomplishment, with now what are some of the the anti-vax conspiracy theories about it and the base and everything like that. So it's this very complicated relationship with the COVID-19 pandemic, but in particular the vaccine and Dr. Fauci.
Interesting mention it. If you're watching any of these Senate hearings, it is usually the Democrats that give that credit to the Trump administration. If there's one thing you're going to see the Democrats give credit to the Trump administration for, it is Operation Warp Speed, and we heard that in that testimony last week in that hearing. So interesting things that we're going to see here. So